There are many extraordinary scenes in the Gospels, of course, but one of the most extraordinary is this one, where Jesus is asleep just when he shouldn't be, or so it appeared to the disciples. And so they come and they imagine them shaking him by the shoulder, "Wake up!" And what does that remind you of? It reminds me of those passages in the Psalms where the psalmist prays to God like that. "Hey, wake up, God. Why are you asleep? People are doing bad things here. It's time you sorted out this mess." And I suspect that Matthew has those passages in mind as well. But he also has other passages in mind because the idea of the sea is a very powerful one in much Jewish thought. When they told the story of creation, they told the story of how God was moving by his Spirit over the primal waters, and then out of those waters God brought order out of that chaos. And then when they told the story of the Exodus, they told the story of how the sea had got in the way of the people of God, and it looked as though they were going to be captured by their slave masters again. And then God broke through the sea and led them to freedom while the sea came back and drowned the people who had been enslaving them. And then in other imagery later on in the Psalms and then in books like Daniel, we see the sea as the chaos monster, the dark force that is still threatening God's people, and God will defeat it. And I think Matthew wants his readers, who knew their Bibles as well and perhaps better than we do, to pick up those overtones. Suddenly here we see not just Jesus doing something really rather spectacular in its own right, but something which carried all those resonances. Maybe this is what it looks like when Israel's God comes back and takes charge. Maybe this is what we ought to expect to happen when we have the Emmanuel, the God with us, in our midst doing all this. And this is what then happens for the church. Matthew is writing for people who, like us, are going out into unknown territory. We don't know what it's going to mean to follow Jesus into tomorrow's world. And one of the images which the church used very early on to describe their own life was the image of a ship, a little boat, adrift on the storms of life. Paul talks about that as well and warns about the high seas and the heavy winds which are going to come and swamp us if we're not careful. And Matthew tells this story for those who are in this little ship called the church and who may think it's getting pretty rough in here. We're not actually sure how we're going to cope. And Jesus seems to be asleep. Why doesn't he do something? And sometimes people take out that same frustration on their church leaders. They think if only our leaders would actually speak up or take a lead or do something, then all our problems would be over. Well, maybe sometimes that has to be done. But the important thing is for those of us in the ship, those of us who are finding it's really rough right now, to come back to Jesus again and again and make Lent the time when we can learn to pray like the psalmist does. Okay, God, it's time to wake up. Come on, Jesus, you're supposed to be in charge here. I think Jesus likes it when we pray like that, rather than being all pie and holier than thou. Okay, do the holy bit as well, but get real in your praying. Get real like the disciples did. Make enough noise to wake Jesus up. Tell him what's really going wrong, what's really on your heart, and then watch out, because he may do even more than you expect.